Hi, this is Brian Kim. I'm going to share with you case number 144 in the Best Way to Do Cataract Surgery series. And this is a question I'm asked all the time. For double chop, how can the phaco tip be used as a chopper? And so I'm going to show how I'm able to use it like a shovel. And so you essentially stab the peripheral lens from the surface with the phaco tip into the lens material like you're stabbing the ground with a shovel. So you can see this is a lens. This is a 3+ dense lens. And I'm using this case because it really does illustrate the density of the lens and how I'm able to use that phaco tip like a shovel. And it does illustrate this principle very well. So I'm turning the eye towards the left and I'm making my paracentesis incision first on the right side and then the left side, making sure I'm parallel to the iris plane, which creates a nice corneal shelf, which will allow me to achieve a self-sealing incision. This is intracameral lidocaine and then some intracameral epinephrine. And this is some dispersive viscoelastic to coat the corneal endothelium and to flatten the anterior capsule. And of course, I made the corneal mark at the beginning of the case. This is a triplanar corneal incision. I make a vertical groove, place the blade into the deep part of the groove, tunnel, turn the eye towards me with a cannula, and then I enter. I push some more viscoelastic in. And these are the Hydrodissection forceps. These are a blunt tip forceps. This is an older case that I have here. You can see as I puncture, it takes a little bit of force, but I'm able to get an opening here. It creates a tear, but it didn't tear exactly the way I wanted to. And that's the downside of having a blunt tip forceps to use as a cystotome. You just don't have as predictable tearing of the capsule. And that's why we developed the sharp tip Hydrodissection forceps. So I'm going around circumferentially, grabbing and re-grabbing. Go ahead and finish off the rhexis, burp some viscoelastic out. And this is the capsulorhexis hydrodissection technique. I place the cannula underneath the rhexis edge contra-incisionally, point the tip down, get a nice wave, decompress on the left side, and then hooking the peripheral lens on the right side, and the lens begins to spin. Irrigating the surface of the eye, lifting the incision with the chopper, going in with irrigation off to minimize Descemet's trauma. And so this is the lens position. You can see the black instrument is a chopper and the pink instrument is a phaco tip. And you know I can get to the peripheral lens holding it from the equatorial side in the capsular fornix with the chopper, but I can't do that with the phaco tip. And so that chopper is going to be in the bag. Obviously, this is an illustration. It doesn't really do service as compared to the actual eye. Obviously, the chopper elbow is deeper in this picture than it really is when I'm doing it in a real patient. But the point is I'm hooking the peripheral lens with the chopper, just like in horizontal chopping technique. But this is a difference. The phaco tip is, again, on top, is within the anterior capsulorhexis opening. And so again, people are like, how are you able to use that with a chopper? How can you gain any leverage to be able to bring the instruments together to crush the lens? Well, you want to think of it like a shovel. You want to think about the phaco tip like you're stabbing, because it does have a point to it, and you're stabbing it into the ground. Well, how are you able to do that? Well, you first have to engage the peripheral lens with the chopper first, because you're holding it on the other side. And since you're holding it on the other side, you have an opposing force, and then you can stab the peripheral lens with the phaco tip, turning the phaco tip vertically, and now you're able to dig into it and then bring the instruments together and fracture the lens in half. So this is in slow motion. You can see I'm removing the surface epinuclear material. You see my chopper is sideways, and I always lead with the tip. I push down, I get underneath the epinucleus. I'm rotating my left hand so the chopper is now pointed vertically, and it's slightly towards me actually, so I can hook the peripheral lens. And now the phaco tip is tilted vertically so I can stab the lens with the phaco tip. So both instruments are now going to be pulled towards the center in the horizontal plane. You should feel the resistance in your fingers as you pull the instruments together. And with dense lenses like this, you'll see equal whitening of the lens material from the compressive forces. Now again, the phaco tip is tilted vertically. I'm stabbing the peripheral lens, and I'm able to do this because I have a counterforce, because the lens is being held with the chopper on the other side. It's holding it in position, in the stationary position. I'm able to turn the phaco tip vertically, stab the peripheral lens, just like I'm stabbing the ground with a shovel. And as I do this, the opposing force as I bring the instruments together is able to fracture through the lens. Now, if you think about it, I'm able to fracture the entire lens from the chopper side. And so then as I'm pushing down with the phaco tip, I'm actually doing the same thing on the other side, but as you can imagine, I'm actually not fracturing in the subincisional area. And so the phaco tip is not going to fracture anything behind it. And so with the dense lenses, you'll see as I fracture, what happens is you'll see the fracturing of all the lens material in front of me, but as I'm able to separate the lens pieces, I'm able to separate and separate, and as the separation movement occurs, then I'm able to fracture and separate the lens material in the subincisional area. So you can see both instruments are brought together in the center. You can feel the opposing forces in your hands and the instrument. You're seeing the whitening, the equal whitening of the lens material from both sides over the chopper and the phaco tip. You see the fracturing, and now you can see the red reflex in front of you. And as I'm separating the instruments here, you can see I brought the chopper more subincisional, and as I did that, it fractured the subincisional lens material completely. Now I turn the chopper sideways again, and I'm gliding it under the rhexis edge on the right side, rotating my hand now so the chopper is vertical, the phaco tip is still deep within the lens material, and because of that, it acts like a wall or an opposing force, or like I say, a cutting board that's kept stationary as the cutting instrument, which is the chopper, is brought towards the cutting board, which is a phaco tip, and then it fractures the right heminucleus completely in half. And so within a few seconds, I have three completely separated lens material with the double chop and cross chop maneuver. I use a little bit of vacuum to pull that first quadrant up out of the bag, and then I use compressive forces, mechanical fracturing forces to crush the lens material in half. I'm able to grab that fragment up with some vacuum, and then again I'm using compressive forces to crush the lens material into smaller and smaller pieces, and then emulsify the lens piece. Grab that other piece, and then I'm fracturing with mechanical forces again, and then using sparing amounts of pulses of ultrasonic energy to remove the lens piece. This is another cross chop maneuver, placing the chopper under the rhexis edge, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip, fracturing that second quadrant in half, lifting that fragment up with some vacuum, and then crushing it into smaller and smaller pieces, and then emulsifying the lens pieces. I'm using some more compressive forces, using the aid of some vacuum to grab those fragments up, using crushing forces to crush the pieces into smaller pieces, and then emulsifying the lens piece. I'm going to rotate the second heminucleus in front of me, placing the chopper around the lens piece with the phaco tip deep in the bag. I'm able to have equal opposing forces around the girth of the lens, fracturing the lens in half, and then placing the chopper around the third quadrant, pulling it towards the phaco tip. And you see I'm moving the phaco tip slightly in position. You saw I was kind of in these small movements repositioning the phaco tip, and that's just so that I can get that equal opposing force so it can fracture equally and evenly. If you don't do that, you might get this tiddlywink when you're bringing the instruments together and the lens piece kind of rotates between the instruments. But when you have that opposing force, you can feel it between your instruments with your fingers, that tactile sensation, and you're able to fracture the lens. And so really that's the nuance of this technique. Again, it's very different from anything else out there. So unless you've done this technique before, you really don't have quite that same understanding of that tactile feel of bringing the instruments together and crushing it. Again, this is almost like using a MyLoop without having to purchase a MyLoop instrument, because the MyLoop acts like a guillotine and it basically severs and cuts the lens completely with a loop. But the principle of mechanical fracturing is no different with this. And you're using the two instruments, same instruments that you use for general cataract surgery, and you can use the same principles of mechanical fracturing with this technique rather than having to purchase a MyLoop. So all the lens is removed, the epinucleus is also removed. So I take the chopper out, push BSS in, take the phaco tip out, and I go in with the INA handpiece. Starting subincisionally, removing the cortical material. This is a pretty dense lens. It's a 3 to 4 plus dense lens. And you can see just using mechanical forces, how I was able to break the lens up. And look at the CDE, it's only 2.46. So I remove all the cortical material, pulling the lens material from anterior to posterior, which pulled off really nicely. I switch to polish mode and I'm polishing underneath the rhexis edge, cleaning any remaining cortical material as well as the lens epithelial cells. I'm polishing the posterior capsule as well. And as you polish the posterior capsule with these dense lenses, you'll see that the posterior capsule puckers sometimes. And again, that's just a sign of zonular laxity, which again is a pretty common theme when you're dealing with these very dense lenses. You just have to be very respectful of the posterior capsule and the zonules with these cases. And that's why switching to polish mode is so helpful, because it gives you that guard. It's like a guardrail. It really helps protect you from using too much vacuum and aspiration and accidentally grabbing the bag and the zonules. So I'm pulsing with BSS into subincisional capsule fornix, which was clean. And now I'm injecting some cohesive viscoelastic to fill the capsular bag. And now I'm switching to the sweep, which I'm going to use to sweep underneath the rhexis edge and polishing off any remaining cortical material as well as lens epithelial cells. And this is a Singer Koch sweep. I really like this one. The angle is great. The paddle is really big. And the part that sweeps has a nice and pointed edge. And that sharper edge does provide better cleaning. Again, sharp enough to polish, but not sharp enough to cut the capsule. So this is a single piece acrylic lens. It's going into the capsular bag. And I quickly transition to the INA handpiece, activate irrigation once I go in, making sure both haptics disengage from the optic and go within the bag. Go underneath the optic, tilting it and rotating it 90 degrees, getting underneath the lens, removing all the viscoelastic within the bag. And it's very important to get all that viscoelastic out. You don't want to have viscoelastic that's left in the eye. And you know you've done this if this happens, because later on that viscoelastic becomes turbid and you're going to think, oh, why is the patient can't see? Oh, is it because of PCO? No, it's because you left this viscoelastic in the bag. And so you'll have to laser that, and then, you don't want that stuff going into the vitreous space. So then once the lens is clean and I've polished some more underneath the rhexis edge, I go ahead and switch to visco mode, remove all the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber, and then I'll hydrate my incisions. Again, you're seeing in detail what I mean when I'm using the phaco tip as a chopper. You're coming from the surface of the lens with the phaco tip. Again, contra-incisionally, you're holding the lens with the chopper in position. You're tilting vertically with the phaco tip, and you're stabbing the peripheral lens like you're stabbing the ground with a shovel. You have equal leverage on either side. You're able to grip the lens from either side. You're bringing the instruments together. You're cutting through the lens material with opposing forces. Actually, you're cutting the lens material through and through from the chopper side, and you're fracturing more or less the top half of the lens material on the phaco tip side. As the instruments are brought together, The fracturing force is so significant that the lens is overcome and it just fractures in half with these dense lenses, as you saw. And when it fractures like that, you can get the chopper a little bit deeper and you can spread the instruments. And as you do that, it propagates into the subincisional lens material. And so that's how you're able to do this maneuver with dense lenses. Now, of course, with soft lenses, the lens material is so soft, you just cheese wire through it. And that's really why it works so well with the soft lenses. But you can do this for the dense lenses as well. And again, because it's propagating that fracturing force into the subincisional area, you're able to get a through and through chop. Again, less successful with the ultra brunescent lenses. That's why I like to create a trough in those and then perform the terminal chop, which propagates deep, and it ensures that you won't get a posterior plate for those cases. But otherwise, double chop works very, very well to soft lenses, to moderately dense lenses. I hope this explanation helps you execute the double chop technique. Hopefully you'll get that eureka moment and you're like, whoa, it worked. And you'll get really excited about this technique. And no other technique out there is able to utilize mechanical fracturing forces and leveraging the principles of mechanical fracturing like this. Again, outside of using something like a MyLoop, which you'd have to buy separately, you can utilize the same instruments that you have for your regular cataract surgery. But again, you need a long chopper if you're going to do this. If you don't have a long chopper, it's not going to be able to hold that lens in position when you're trying to do the double chop maneuver. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.